Hello, I hope whoever is seeing this is doing well. My name is Kennedy Carter, and for this project, I chose to study the Columbia Space Shuttle crisis that occurred in 2003. During this crisis, there were 7 fatalities, and NASA was grounded from further space shuttle flights for 2 years following the crisis. Here is the PowerPoint for my Columbia Space Shuttle crisis case study. So first off, the case study kind of overview. So the Columbia Space Shuttle was funded by NASA and it was launched on January 16th, 2003. There were 7 crew members aboard the space shuttle, and their names were Rick Husband, David Brown, Laurel Clark, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, and Iana Raymond. During launch, a piece of foam insulation was detached from the shuttle's propellant tank. It hit the left wing of the shuttle and it damaged it. Both the flight and ground crew were aware that the foam had detached, and they knew that it hit somewhere, but they weren't sure exactly where, so the extent of the damage wasn't known. Here's a picture of the crew, or a couple pictures. The first one is kind of their formal picture, and then one of them on the actual space shuttle. Similar occurrences had happened before the Columbia Space Shuttle where foam pieces would break off or pieces like that, but none had resulted in a crisis like this or really any crisis at all. So the Columbia continued on schedule and it entered back into Earth's atmosphere 16 days later on February 1st, 2003. The damage of the wing became known as they started entering Earth's atmosphere, and the whole process was really quick. The heat entered through the wing and it damaged the hydraulic system. So the shuttle began spiraling, and as it spiraled, it broke apart completely until it was in shambles. And during the breaking apart of the shuttle, all of the crew members perished. But sort of a fun fact, the tester worms that the Columbia took up into space for whatever project they were doing actually survived the re-entry back into Earth's atmosphere and the breaking apart of the space shuttle. So the stakeholders for this project or this mission, the Columbia mission, were NASA and then the North American Rockwell Corporation or Rockwell International. And NASA also received funding and approval from the U.S. Congress, so they were a stakeholder as well. So NASA's initial reaction, they sent out a search and rescue team that later declared the crew lost as they perished in the re-entry process. And here's a quote from Sean O'Keefe, NASA's administrator at the time. He said, "This is indeed a tragic day for the NASA family, for the families of the astronauts who flew on STS-107, and likewise is tragic for the nation." NASA was honest and took responsibility, and they faced the scrutiny that came from the crisis. So a breakdown of the stages that kind of occurred during this crisis. So an issue was detected as the foam piece detached from the space shuttle, but the issue wasn't really taken seriously enough. So therefore NASA's failure occurred in the prevention stage. The nature of the crisis situation made containment virtually impossible because it happened so fast. They didn't have time to really stop it in its tracks. Once the destruction began, there was no stopping it. So the recovery process took years for NASA because they were benched from further flights until all of their kinks were worked out, and so they were benched until July of 2005, which is 2.5 years later. So a board was created to investigate the Columbia crisis, and NASA took the findings actually from that investigation to better their next shuttles, and that's what we see as the learning stage. So the crisis aftermath, again, NASA was grounded from space missions for 2.5 years. So they had scrutiny, they had a lot of things that they needed to fix. And NASA actually received more funding from the U.S. Congress so that a crisis like this wouldn't happen again. And NASA's now equipped all space shuttles with more cameras so that you can see every angle of the hull of the space shuttle, so that if something does break apart, or any damage occurs, they can see it exactly where it is and they can send up something to fix it. Some of the strengths of NASA's reaction to the crisis were they took responsibility, complete responsibility. They apologized and released an empathetic statement to the public saying, this is a tragic accident. We're grieving with you, and we're really sorry that this happened, basically. They realized rebuilding their name would take time, but they thankfully had a good reputation to back them up because NASA's well known across the nation. And they were honest about what happened, which is really important. And when talking about the deaths of the crew, NASA showed great sensitivity and empathy for the families. So the biggest weakness of NASA's reaction was when the initial issue was detected. They didn't take enough precautions to avoid that crisis, but they knew that something like that could happen, but they just weren't prepared for the magnitude of what did happen. They didn't pay enough attention to the prodromes, and so attention for the prodrome wasn't heavy enough since similar things had happened before, but they never really fixed the underlying problem. So what NASA could have done better is, of course, fielding for issues and correcting problems to ward against the crisis, because, again, they knew that something like this could happen, and they had the means of fixing it, but they really didn't. They should also have paid attention to the prodromes much more in depth, just to know if this does happen, what we could do to fix it before a crisis like this happens. And here's a picture of the Columbia Space Shuttle as it was launching, and then there's another picture of the Columbia Space Shuttle.